Welcome to The Backstory with Dr. Ricky Singh. This podcast is focused on bringing you the latest research-based information about dramatically improving health, well-being, and quality of life. And here's your host, Dr. Ricky Singh.
Here in the United States, we have now seen that more than half the population of the adults have been vaccinated. I think the last time I checked, it was almost 180 or 200 million persons vaccinated in the United States. The mask mandates are lifting and deaths are going down. Everyone's feeling pretty good. It's the summer in New York City. I know I'm excited. But before we burn our masks and start going to indoor dining and kind of forgetting all of the risk mitigation strategies that we so hardcore practiced the last year, I kind of wanted to bring an expert in to sit down and talk to us about what we should and should not do and where we are in the state of this pandemic. So my guest today is an associate professor of medicine and orthopedic surgery out of Albert Einstein College of Medicine. She serves as the medical director of the Antimicrobial Stewardship Program and the program director of the Infectious Disease Fellowship. So I'm really excited to bring on my good friend. I've known her for 25 years, something like that. Dr. Priya Nori. Dr. Nori, welcome to The Backstory.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you for aging us both on your podcast. Well, that was delightful.
Well, they don't know how old we were when we started undergrad in medical school, so we could be Doogie Howsers. But thank you for being here today.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
So before we get started and talk about the state of the pandemic and where we are in the United States and especially globally, you know, there's a lot of talk about vaccine hesitancy. There's a lot of different vaccine options that are available to us here in the United States. So tell us a little bit about the vaccines in general. What can we use here in the U.S.? What's the technology behind them? And talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. It'd be my pleasure to do so. So we have currently 3 vaccines that have received FDA emergency use authorization. And so what that means is that during a pandemic, the government, their regulatory body, the FDA, has authorization to rapidly but very rigorously review all the clinical trial data for a new product, whether it be a new treatment for COVID, a new test, or a vaccine. And so they kind of have a very accelerated but still very robust review process, and then ultimately a clearance and authorization for mass distribution, essentially for free to all of the residents of the United States. And hopefully that also builds a momentum elsewhere in other countries for their regulatory agencies to do the same.
Once one of these vaccines does get this emergency use authorization, is there a time frame when it's no longer under that category and now it's actually FDA approved?
Yes. So currently all 3 of the authorized vaccines, so just to review, these are the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine that received its authorization first, followed by Moderna. So those are our 2 mRNA vaccines, 2 shots each. And then the third one that received authorization is the Janssen vaccine, or commonly called the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And so that's a 1-dose vaccine. That technology is a little bit different. That's a viral vector vaccine. And so once the authorization review process occurs, which takes several weeks, and once the FDA and another organization called ASHP, which provides all the guidance behind how and when and for whom to give a vaccine, once they get together and say, yes, we're ready, very quickly, these vaccines are then distributed throughout the United States to big hospitals, to nursing homes, to clinics, and all sorts of places.
Talk to us a little bit about the difference between these 2 types of vaccine. You said one, the Pfizer and the Moderna are the mRNA, and the Johnson & Johnson is a viral vector. Just briefly, kind of without getting into the heart of the science behind it, talk to us a little bit about the difference between those 2 options.
So as for an everyday citizen or a resident of New York City or elsewhere in the country, what does that mean for someone like that? So there are both practical aspects and then also personal health issues that are particular to each vaccine. The mRNA vaccines, so these are the Pfizer and the Moderna, these are new in the sense that this technology has not really been used for licensed vaccines before. But just to be very clear, the technology is actually several decades old, about 30 years old. And the NIH actually holds the patents for this vaccine technology and basically licensed it out, so to speak, to these different drug companies to produce at scale enough vaccine to go around. And so while they seem kind of hot off the press and rather new, it's very important for your audience to understand that actually this is a very trusted and extremely innovative technology. It is without a doubt the scientific breakthrough of our generation. It's already saved millions upon millions of lives, close to 1 billion lives, I would say. And so it is an older technology or a not that new of a technology, but it's sort of gotten a second rebranding for this purpose.
So how does that work actually? What is the mRNA? There's concern. I talk to patients on a daily basis. And they're like, this is gene therapy. It's going to go into my DNA. It's going to manipulate my DNA, and I'm going to get all these adverse events. We're not going to get into the whole microchip Bill Gates theory, of course, but tell us about the mRNA. What is actually happening with the vaccine?
Absolutely, sure. So it's a very small segment of mRNA. So SARS-CoV-2, or the virus that causes COVID, is an RNA vaccine. So you take a very strategic part of that, the part that encodes something called the spike protein, which is now well known when you see the image of the virus. These are the spokes that come out of the ball, so to speak. And these are the part of the virus that mediates the attachment and the virus actually being absorbed into the cells of your body, especially the lungs, the heart, all these critical organs. And so the mRNA technology basically takes that segment. Okay. It is basically encapsulated in a little lipid like fat molecule, and it's injected into people's shoulders. And then from that, the immune system takes that up. Okay. It learns the code. Okay. And then it uses our machinery to make proteins, to make the spike proteins. So our bodies, upon receipt of the vaccine, are actually making these proteins and then ultimately antibodies against that spike protein. It absolutely does not integrate into our own genetic code. It does not become part of us. So we're not like, 99% human and 1% coronavirus. Although that would be kind of cool in a very cool science fiction movie, that is not actually what's happening. Once that mRNA is injected into your body, it disintegrates. It breaks down just like anything else, like a hamburger you would eat, in a couple of weeks.
Is there any chance that by administering or receiving the vaccine, you could get infected with coronavirus?
Great question, Rick. Absolutely not. We can say with a high degree of confidence that will not happen. However, what people may experience is a physiologic reaction, an immune reaction that resembles loosely the symptoms of COVID. So these are things like a couple of days of body aches, low-grade fevers, sometimes a little headache, or just, feeling down for a few days. But what I tend to tell patients who are asking me specifically about what to anticipate in terms of vaccine side effects, I say, you know what? All those things are good. It means your body's responding. It means that your immune system is revving up to this and recognizes this as a foreign substance that it should react to. So experiencing those side effects is completely expected, and that way you know that you're not in the placebo arm, so to speak. Several of my colleagues and friends signed up to be part of these vaccine trials, and they totally knew which arm they were in because they either got body aches or they didn't.
How did these two mRNA vaccines, both the Pfizer and the Moderna, compare with then the Johnson & Johnson viral vector vaccine? How does that work?
Great question. So practically speaking, if I were a consumer, right, and if I were deciding for myself, not as a healthcare worker, but deciding for me or a family member which one to get, because the Johnson & Johnson vaccine utilizes a little bit of a more recognizable technology that's been around for a long time, that several other types of vaccines that I may have received throughout my life take advantage of that same kind of technology, which is basically tagging the part of the virus to another killed virus that will carry it into the cells and then ultimately lead to the immune response and antibodies that are produced against COVID, basically. And so that is a little bit easier for some people to palate because it's a technology that's been around longer, that other types of vaccines utilize. And the major advantage is that it's only one shot. Let's spend a little time on the J&J because, unfortunately, there was a pause while the FDA and CDC were reviewing a series of very unexpected but side effects related to blood clots, specifically in the brain and in the lungs. But ultimately, the rate of those side effects was something like 6 in a million or something like that. Very low rate of side effects. And it was ultimately, it's kind of predictable who is at higher risk for those. And so once the pause was lifted and J&J was brought back to the vaccine arena, a warning was attached to that, which was not recommended essentially for women of childbearing age, so under 50. And this is because we produce estrogen, and so that already puts us at risk for blood clots, and so to be avoided in that risk group. However, there are lots of adolescents who are under that age group. There are plenty of people who are older than that age group. There are men, right? Plenty of eligible folks. And guess what? If, a country like Nepal or Bangladesh, I guarantee that they would take those doses off our hands, whatever we didn't use here in the States.
It's interesting. I feel like there's kind of this vaccine elitism that has developed. People say, are you vaccinated? And the questions don't stop there. They ask, well, what'd you get? Did you get the Pfizer? And if you did, you're like, all right, you got the Bentley of vaccines. And some, unfortunately, don't have access to those because it requires storage and the cold preparation, whereas they do have access to the J&J. And they're like, no, I'm not getting the J&J because of what I read in the news or what I heard on social media. So how do we really change that narrative and say, it is safe. The odds, just like you mentioned, 6 in a million or even better than that adverse event is not likely. And take the vaccine if you can get it. So
here's what I would say to folks. Of the 3 authorized vaccines in the United States, the J&J vaccine is the only one that was tested in real time. And what I mean by that is that the Moderna and Pfizer clinical trials of phase 3, those were occurring basically this time last summer. Okay, where we didn't really know about B117 and B 351 and all these other variants of concern that emerged basically in late fall 2020 and are prevalent now throughout the world. And so those vaccines were tested against what we consider sort of the original, like the OG version of the virus that didn't have these scary mutations. However, the J&J trials happened later on, and they had, as part of their trial sites, they had places like South Africa, South America, and places where these viral variants of concern are prevalent. And it still held up quite well. The efficacy was still, somewhere around 70% or more. Not to mention that there are trials of homegrown Indian vaccines that are being tested now against their predominating strain, which is the 617. And the efficacy seems pretty high, around something like 70% or more. And so we have more real-world data in real time that it is effective against these variants.
I'm glad you brought that up. And speaking of real-time genetic drift and mutations of viruses, we, especially in healthcare and first responders, frontline workers, we all get the flu shot every year. And usually the flu shot manufacturers don't know what the flu shot's even going to be until the spring before we administer it in the fall, because they're working in real time. They're seeing what are the strains out there. So we have to get a flu shot every year. Yet the old, reliable measles vaccine that we got 2 shots of 40 years ago for me, I'll age myself on this podcast, and I'm still good. I'm still protected. Lifelong immunity from measles. Where do you find the SARS-CoV-2 virus? Are we going to get an annual new updated vaccine every year, or should we kind of be protected?
So many great questions. There's a lot to unpack there. The mRNA vaccines because they came out first, we are getting real world data on these in the setting of variants, in the setting of use, not only in healthcare workers, but in people from the community all over the world. And it seems as though, yes, these vaccines work well against whatever viral variant you throw at them. There may be a somewhat of a reduction in its ability, in the antibodies' ability to neutralize or bind to these viruses and take them out of the mix, but they're still highly effective. And we're getting all that data now, and we should get that back from the J&J vaccine as well in the coming months. So initially, rewind to about 3 or 4 months ago when variants were just kind of, pardon my French, kicking our ass. And we even discovered that we have our own version here in New York City. I mean, of course we have our own variant, right? We're New York City after all. We have our own version of everything. We have our own brand of everything. Why not SARS-CoV-2? And so we in the public health community, we were rather worried. We didn't actually know how these mRNA vaccines would perform and if a booster shot was going to be required. If you asked me back then, let's say in January or February, I would have said, you know what? Yes, I think we're going to need a new one of these shots every year. However, now it may not be the case. And this is because we've learned so much since that time. We know that they're performing quite well against variants. Maybe not 100%, but you know what? Enough to prevent deaths, enough to keep people out of the hospital, enough to even prevent an infected, vaccinated person from spreading it in their household. And so it's looking less likely that is going to be needed. Also, every month that goes by, we get a very well done scientific study that says these antibodies last longer and longer. These other types of immune cells like B cells, T cells, memory cells, some of these last for our entire lives. And so going back to what you said about the measles vaccine, measles was probably, prior to our current COVID vaccines, was probably one of the most effective vaccines in that 2 shots is more than 95% effective at preventing illness. And that lasts nearly your whole entire life. And so that was kind of like the gold standard. That was the one to beat. And these COVID vaccines are looking like they're going to be nearly there. And in the end of the day, I think that may be the case. What's really good is that if needed, right? If COVID threw us again for a loop in a way that we were not expecting, these mRNA platforms can very rapidly be adapted to create new versions of themselves all the time. I mean, within a couple of months, these companies can produce these vaccines at scale that may have additional coverage against variants that we may not even know about right now.
Globally, we know the death toll, 3.5 million is what some cite, and some research, even at the University of Washington School of Medicine, cite that it might be 2 or 3 times higher than that. You mentioned the variants, the South African variant of 351, the UK of 117, and the Indian virus, right, 1617. And India recently in May had the highest COVID death in a single day from any other country in the history of the pandemic, with 4,400 deaths in a single day. And on May 7th, they had 400,000 cases in a single day. So in speaking of the variants, let's shift a little bit to talk about India. We're both of Indian American heritage and descent, and obviously we have family that lives in India. So tell us, what is going on in India? What has been happening the last month? And how are we going to change the situation there in India with the pandemic?
It's so interesting. Things are getting so much better here. Mask mandates have been lifted. We can navigate almost our entire days without wearing a mask outside of patient care. And everyone around us is celebrating, right? But for people like us and our friends and our families, we really can't celebrate because of what's going on back home. It's a very complex situation. And unfortunately, similar to what happened here in the early part of 2020, a lot of unfortunate political interference contributed to where India is currently today. Thankfully, because finally of strategic lockdowns in each state within India and other really focused interventions, the new case counts are coming down. They've turned the corner a few weeks ago. And so now that is kind of in the exponential decline stage of things. But as we've seen here, deaths, hospitalizations, these things always lag a few weeks behind because of how the virus works. So there's still thousands upon thousands of deaths per day, which, as you mentioned, is probably an undercount. So lots went into the unfortunate situation of how they ended up there. But of course, the very basic ones are the fact that there are more than 1.4 billion people that live there. It's a largely urban concentration in terms of the population. And so it was really the big cities like Delhi that suffered the greatest toll. But now, believe it or not, the pandemic there is shifting where it's becoming a rural illness. And they need far more help because of the lack of access, the lack of even things like health literacy, other medications, just so many challenges. Another major challenge is that, it's very hard to lock down over there because there's a lot of migrant workers, there's daily wage laborers, and they're utterly dependent on that. And that would have been just crushing for them. And this is something I learned actually from doctors, speaking to doctors there, that some of the things that worked for you guys just won't work for us. The other, I think, major challenge is that there wasn't any coordinated effort to get everyone on the same page in terms of this is how you fight this disease. This is how you prevent this disease. If somebody's sick with the illness, here's exactly what you should do. And this was because of largely desperation. It was like us in March of 2020. We wanted everything to work. We tried everything and we wanted so badly for it to work. And instead of really taking those lessons from everywhere else in the world, unfortunately, the regulatory agencies, so their version of the FDA, what they did was they just approved all kinds of honestly crap without the data, without the clinical trial data. And this was really just from pressure, from just desperation. And so early on, until more recently, there were lots of things in their protocols that we would never use anymore, like hydroxychloroquine, all kinds of antibiotics, steroids for people at home, all kinds of crazy vitamins, and ivermectin is a big one that they're using over there. And there was no quote unquote stewardship of any of these drugs. And so lots of fallout from doing things like this, which is that we're seeing an epidemic within an epidemic, which is the black fungus, quote unquote, or mucormycosis. And so this is happening because of the basically indiscriminate steroid use that's going on over there. Finally, thankfully, this is starting to improve, largely in part a movement kind of started by doctors here at the Mayo Clinic and other places. So doctors of Indian origin who are well known in the field of virology and public health and infectious diseases, they sort of said, look, okay, this is you guys have to get it together. This is how we would treat the illness here. You have to develop your protocols in a way to generally reflect these evidence-based recommendations. We in America, we respect the fact that people don't have hospital beds, they don't have oxygen, and you're doing management at home for people that otherwise should be hospitalized. And we respect that. Nevertheless, you have to rein it in, and here's how we're going to help you do that.
Even with the perfect COVID-19 playbook, and we experienced this last summer, we were drafted, I guess I should say, back into the hospitals, and a lot of doctors, we knew very little about COVID. We thought it was a pneumonia. We were giving antibiotics and steroids, and people talked about hydroxychloroquine, and we know that didn't work and it was not efficacious. But despite that, we never really got a handle of the pandemic here in the United States until a vaccine came out. So despite perfect risk mitigation, besides having access to masks and our capability of social distancing and hand sanitizers, things that we take for granted, and probably the vast majority of the Indian population does not have access to these things. So despite all those things, we still couldn't get control of the pandemic here until the vaccines came out. So where are we about the vaccines in India? Where are they? How can we help? Or are there opportunities for cross-global kind of collaboration?
Absolutely, Rick. Great question once again. When you were raising that question, I couldn't help but thinking of countries like South Korea and Japan. They went about their public health measures in an extremely austere way, and it was the perfect laboratory for showing how effective those measures were. And they, without help from vaccines, they got their pandemic phases under control. However, if we fast forward to present day, what we see is that things are picking back up. They're having second and third surges, and this is because they weren't prepared with vaccines, and they don't locally produce them, and the demand-supply equation is not in their favor. And so we're definitely seeing things go back up in places like Japan and Taiwan and lots of countries in Asia, despite all those very stringent public health measures. And so India is very unique in the sense that it's a country of dichotomies, more so than any other place on earth. You have extreme, IQ and intellectual prowess and innovation, but then you also have extreme poverty. So you have local vaccine producers. You have the Serum Institute of India. You have major pharmaceutical companies who have capabilities, who can produce vaccines and produce COVID drugs. But, because of perhaps some degree of hubris or just policy failures, what happened was India outsourced. They sent their vaccines out to other countries, and they had contracts that, they're unable to fulfill now because they had to divert those doses back and give them to the federal government to distribute. So it's a perfect example of what we know very well about India, which is that you have, billionaires and you have extreme access and innovation, but then you have a large percentage of the population with none of those things. And so basically now the situation in India is that specifically with vaccines is that it's continuing at a slow but steady rate. It's increasing a little bit more each day. Vaccines are being administered on the order of several millions per day, which is good, right? However, if you think about how many people there are, I think it's like under 5% of the total population. But as of yesterday, so today is June 4th, if last I checked, the White House, President Biden made a pretty major announcement yesterday that 75% of the excess doses of vaccines that the United States has will be donated to countries in need, either through an initiative called COVAX, which is a global vaccine sharing initiative, in part run by the WHO. And then the rest of that surplus will go directly to certain strategic partners that the United States has. So we don't know who they are just yet. While people who are very kind of austere about this might say that's not enough, it's definitely a start. The way that he described it is it's a down payment. And so he recognizes and he announced publicly that rich countries like ours and the UK and other Western European nations have a moral obligation to vaccinate the world. However, the other part of that is we also have to transfer technology. We have to transfer patents and issue waivers and give them the means and the know-how to produce vaccines for themselves. And so one of the very big arguments right now is whether or not the United States should push for these vaccine waivers so that our pharmaceutical companies that are based in the United States or Europe will be sort of, there will be pressure put on them to transfer their know-how. It's a very complicated issue, and I don't even want to pretend that I'm an expert by any means in that area. But if anyone's interested in learning more about this particular topic, there are two excellent podcasts. One is The Argument, the New York Times. Recently, they had an episode, I think just earlier this week, where they had someone argue in favor of waivers and transfers of technology and then against that. But ultimately, the bottom line is that there has to be a more equitable way to share excess vaccines, but also for countries like South Africa and Bangladesh and Ethiopia to be able to do this for themselves. Like one of the gentlemen quoted in that podcast said, every country should get to be their own superhero, not just the Western nations.
And speaking of how this pandemic has no boundaries, we know that. We're sitting here in New York, remote learning is going to end, and schools are open, sporting arenas are open, restaurants are open, and we're sitting here, hey, we did a good job here in New York, we did a good job here in the United States. And you've made it clear that we need to care about the global community, because unless we vaccinate the world, this pandemic is not going to end. It's going to travel, it's going to come in a plane or a ship or somewhere, and it's going to come back and mutate and mutate and mutate. So it's really our responsibility to educate, to give when we can give, and these are all kind of spiritual things that we talk about anyway. But you're doing a lot of work with a nonprofit organization in New York called the AFIA Foundation through hashtag COVID India. So tell me a little bit about this foundation, your work with them, and how people, our listeners, can help with that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ricky, for the opportunity. So the AFIA Foundation is based in New York, actually. And so this was the most trusted, well-established organization that I found through contacts at the Greater New York Hospital Association that has a very long-standing relationship with New York Presbyterian, with Montefiore, with Mount Sinai, with lots of our hospitals. And so this was one of the major organizations that back in our first pandemic wave helped all of us get N95s, get PPE, get ventilators, and all of these life-saving things. And so now, basically since the start of the pandemic, they've been working to source all this equipment, especially oxygen and hospital beds and monitors and ventilators and all of that, and get it on a plane, take care of the logistic charges, and then work with partner organizations in India with the know-how on the ground to, deal with customs and all of those things that we know about, and to get it to the places most in need. And so I really clicked with them immensely, because not only are they local, they know all of our hospitals really well. And actually, NYP recently donated, I believe, something like 300 hospital beds, which are, as we speak, going overseas to India to help set up field hospitals and build up their surge capacity. So for people who really desperately would love to help, just don't know how to do so, please do visit afiafoundation.org. And so that's AFYA. You can even just Google that, AFIA, AFYA, and then you'll see the kind of work that they're doing. And I'm so happy to be partnering with NYP and Sinai and lots of other hospitals to kind of pool our efforts and send much needed equipment overseas. And so, once that work is not done, we'll help India get through it, but then it could be sub-Saharan Africa and then other places in Latin America. So just like you said, until there are shots in everyone's arms, there will be hotspots, and so we have to continue to respond to those.
We'll definitely share that website and the information on our podcast notes, so that'll be a great resource for our listeners. And I'm thinking about, while you're speaking of global collaboration, and here we are, we're very fortunate. We have a surplus of vaccines, presumably. We'll hopefully get all of our citizens vaccinated, or residents. And I remember back in March and April of 2020, we were on the receiving end of some of this generosity. We had ventilators shipped to us from other countries, and it's kind of our obligation to pay it back and to pay the global community in the healthcare perspective so we can get back to some semblance of normalcy. What does that look like for us? What does normal look like for us coming this fall and maybe this winter?
So, Rick, it is possible. I'm very optimistic that there is a path to eradication, just like the first SARS or smallpox, measles. All these things really are not an issue like they once were. And so we can get there, but we have to keep our eye on the prize. For segments of our society that are not yet vaccinated or not completely vaccinated, we have to reach out to those folks. We have to bring them in the fold. We have to address their concerns on a very personal level, not kind of talk at them, but speak with them, and and try to understand why they feel certain ways about things. And if today's not the right day for them, then maybe next month or the month after that. But let's not ever let that conversation drop. While about 50% of the United States population at this point, I believe, is completely vaccinated. If you look at specific segments of society or specific locations, I was looking at the New York State Health Department map today, and where we live, where we are, the vaccination uptake is awesome. It's like probably on average in the 70%. And then the older the age group, they're good. They've been good for a while. But then if you look at where I work in the Bronx, it's more like, there's neighborhoods that are like 30, 40%. And then in upstate New York, likewise. And so there's still a lot of work to do locally. If we're truly on a path to eradication, there's still a lot of work to do. And some people might hesitate because they had the illness a couple months ago, either in 2020 or earlier 2021. And, what I say to my patients for whom that is the case, I say, okay, that buys you a little time. You're probably right about that. You're protected for a little while and you're unlikely to be reinfected because we know that reinfection, despite variants and such, is still a very infrequent occurrence. But you don't have forever. And studies are kind of showing that protection from the illness is different from protection from the vaccines, and that protections from the vaccines potentially may be more durable or may invoke like different parts of the immune system that are potentially longer lasting. And we just don't know yet, but that protection is definitely not forever. So at some point, they're going to have to kind of reckon with that and make a personal decision for themselves. But hopefully seeing all the people around them who've received the vaccines and are doing fine and certainly don't have tracking devices like popping out of their eyeballs or whatever, that will help them to come around to this movement.
We had a really good conversation with one of our psychiatrists here a few weeks ago on addiction, and his comment was we need to meet people where they are. And that's the only way for us to move the needle.
Yes.
And a few weeks ago, we spoke with Dr. Susana Morales about vaccine hesitancy. And again, addressing those communities with where they are, where their belief system are, and that's the only way we're going to actually get out of this pandemic. Well, Dr. Nori, it's a pleasure chatting with you. I don't think we've actually sat down and chatted in many, many years, especially about a healthcare-related topic. So I appreciate you spending time and educating our listeners about something you're obviously very passionate about with COVID-19, the vaccine program, and actually global health. So I appreciate you hanging out with us here at The Backstory. And to all you out there, the listeners, thank you for tuning into The Backstory. And remember, when it comes to your health, when it comes to your wellness, we've got your back. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for listening to The Backstory. Please subscribe, rate the podcast, and review The Backstory on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and Google Play Music. And feel free to share this podcast on social media or even your own website or blog. This podcast is for general information purposes only. It does not constitute the practice of medicine, including the giving of medical advice. No doctor-patient relationship is formed. The use of this information is at the user's own risk. The content of this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for medical advice. To learn more about Dr. Singh and his clinical research, please follow him on social media. You can also sign up for his newsletter by going to www.rickysinghmd.com. That's RICKYSINGHMD.com.